Hello, welcome to Graphic Policy Radio at the intersection of comics and movements for social change. This is your host, Ilana Levin, and this is a comics podcast. This is a comics podcast for folks who know the value of keeping important political works in print. And joining me today are two legends in the industry, Steve Darnall and Alex Ross. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited. And for folks who are unfamiliar, here's a little bit about Uncle Sam and the creators of the book. Timed for this year's election, Uncle Sam makes its return after nearly a decade of being out of print. Uncle Sam's Special Election Edition, August 6, 2024, is a vibrant, hallucinatory tour of modern America, the story of a star-spangled vagrant named Sam, who is guided by the voices in his head and his own fractured memories. Absorbed by history, traveling, visions of America's dark past, Uncle Sam struggles to remember his true identity and piece together the scattered clues of his own experiences in the deep and thoughtful look at America's checkered past. Steve Darnall first worked with Alex Ross when the two collaborated on Human Torch Story that served as the inspiration for the award-winning 93 series Marvels. Steve being a consultant on the movie Being the Ricardos and Ken Burns' documentary Country Music. He is also the editor of Nostalgia Digest magazine and the host of 2 weekly radio shows dedicated to the golden age of radio. Welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you very much, Ilana. Lovely to be here.
Yes, and I know nostalgia actually will be a theme we'll be hitting on a few times throughout this episode at least.
It's not what it used to be, is it? Yeah.
And also joining me is Alex Ross. Alex studied illustration at the American Academy of Art in Chicago, then honed his craft as a storyboard artist before entering the comics field. His miniseries Marvels opened a wider acceptance for painted comics. In 1996, he moved on to produce the equally successful Kingdom Come for DC Comics. Ross is also the writer and artist of Fantastic Four Full Circle, the award-winning national bestseller, and the Alex Ross Marvel Comics poster book, and the Alex Ross Marvel Comics Supervillains poster book. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, I am so excited. I want to get you guys started by talking about the importance of re-releasing the book right now. I mean, obviously, all creators want to have their work in print. That's a given. But what was the significance of this being a special election release book to come out?
I think the credit for that really goes to Abrams. You know, we've both known Charlie Kochman over there for a good number of years. And of course, Alex has worked with him numerous times in recent years. So all I know for sure is, as you say, Ilana, is I thought the book should be back in print. And Charlie, I think, agreed with Alex and I on that front and figured if there was ever a time to do it, this was it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and they brought it up to me in a meeting I had with them a year ago. Charlie's publisher had proposed this to me, and it was a thrilling idea, the idea of the timing of it. We've also had it potential for many elections that have passed us by where we thought, oh, this one would be good to time to. But this was great to have a new publisher step in and say, we can get something done that DC wasn't choosing to do on their own. And it was nice that it worked out so well with DC agreeing to it and not really looking to put up any roadblocks with it. But it took having somebody outside say, we see the value of this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, certainly as a reader, we see the value of this. And, you know, I'm pretty sure the first time that I really came aware of your work was from the Village Voice a feature in like 1997 that you had painted the cover. And it was about you and Neil Adams. And I guess it was then focusing on the Uncle Sam book. Yes. And Uncle Sam was on the cover of the Voice. And it talked about both Uncle Sam and Neil Adams would work with Denny O'Neil on the hard traveling heroes from the Green Arrow, Green Lantern.
Yes.
And I literally had panels from this reprinted from the Village Voice on my wall in college. And it was sort of one of my answers to anybody who was sort of questioning, you know, comics' ability to communicate around serious political material. And I think people talk about Neil Adams, you know, him coming from sort of from a realist orientation to art as an inspiration for you stylistically. But, you know, I'd love to hear you talk about the influence of his work for you creatively in terms of the kinds of subject matter you look at and the writing that you do together?
Well, certainly Neil Adams' effect upon the entire industry and art form, every artist, was all pervasive. So if you're growing up in the 70s as I did, you couldn't avoid it and you couldn't not be influenced by it. And I have direct influence in the sense that I have personal inspiration from ways I've tried to emulate Neil's influence on me directly. But a lot of my life, I wasn't even so focused upon how he was that influence, just that everything I thought of as being a certain peak of realism and quality in the field was met by Neil's legend. And his body of work back in the late 60s, throughout the 70s and on from there was just, it was the highest level of what we had seen for realism brought into the industry, as well as incorporating it with a proper kind of fluidity that made it work in comics and did not ever seem like it was somehow tracings of photos. That's what I would get accused of. Ultimately, I was getting more a chance to actually extrapolate that influence in the work on this project, because the figure of Uncle Sam is a more articulated anachronism and exaggeration, a more comic, cartooning-like figure because of the exaggerated features and the kind of expression that I was never doing in prior works like Marvel's or Kingdom Come. Here I had this very emotive figure that I did use a live model for, but every part of his physicality was exaggerated because I was applying more or less a veneer of new facial features to him that he didn't have. He was a younger looking man, and certainly didn't have a long nose and the hair and the beard, all those things that make the figure a much more cartooning ready kind of archetype.
And I know that when we were in the planning stages for Uncle Sam, that the work that Neil and Denny O'Neil did together came up a lot. I mean, one of the things we discussed with Karen Berger, who was our editor on this book, was that, you know, what Neil and Denny did on the Green Lantern, Green Arrow book it was important. We didn't want to simply replicate that. And I think one of the things they did, to their credit, was they were able to tell these stories and couch them in metaphors, because there were certain things with the Comics Code even in 1970 you couldn't do. So, you know, if they did a story about overpopulation, it was on this planet. If they did something about corruption, you know, it was this abstract thing. It was well done, but we also felt that we didn't want to do that, you know, in the sense
I'd like to point out amongst those examples that I believe that Neil was driven to draw the likeness of Spiro Agnew on one of those comics. So he wanted to get very directly towards the corruption of the time and political figures that he wanted to speak towards. So it wasn't Spiro Agnew in the story, I believe, but
right.
it was his face in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
He did go. Yes, I'm sure he had nattering nabobs of negativity nonetheless. Well, of course. And I mean, we had the good fortune a quarter of a century later to be with a line of mature readers' comics. So, I mean, we had an advantage that maybe Neil Adams and Denny O'Neil didn't have when they were doing a superhero book in 1970, you know?
Right.
Absolutely. Right.
Yeah. One of the things that first struck me upon this reread is the way Uncle Sam talks in these snippets of quotes and references. He's just speaking in memes. And I mean, meme as a concept, you know, predates the book, but it wasn't a word that people just used in common parlance until the recent period. And it feels so ahead of its time to have your Uncle Sam just speaking in memes throughout the whole book.
You know, I actually have to give credit to the rap music of the 90s. And I am hardly an expert on these things. I'm not going to position myself as one, but I remember in the early 90s, that's when a lot of these acts like Public Enemy and KRS-One and all of them were really, well, De La Soul, another great example, but they were all relying heavily on samples. And it was really the first time anybody had the idea. It's like, yes, let's take that thing, yank it out of context and put it in here. And again, I'm not going to position myself as a man of the street. I'm not. But it was fascinating as an exercise to sort of think, yeah, we could do something like that, where you're just walking down the street and then suddenly, the words of Ronald Reagan pop up, or the words of Spiro Agnew, or whatever the case may be.
And I know that certainly if I was a lone figure making this kind of work on my own, I never would have had the instinct for that. That was purely Steve's kind of vibe and idea to move forward on it. And of course, he was adding to the level of the confusion the character's going through as to him sort of channeling points of history and quotes from different time periods. But I never would have had that instinct naturally myself.
And part of that was, of course, to lend to the idea that this might be just a mentally unstable homeless person. And so I was sort of deliberately looking for phrases that, out of context, coming from somebody you might dismiss as a derelict, would make you look and say, wow, is that man insane? It's sort of like, where is he coming from with this? That makes no sense at all.
Although I would say that in the narrative itself, I don't think that we were ever properly committed to selling the idea that you were actually getting somebody who might be genuinely out of their mind. For me, I never saw it as anything other than we've got the fictional character, the representation of America, wandering around unsure of who he was. We were just going along with him until he figured it out and accepted it. But I never believed we were really selling the idea of, are we or aren't we portraying a real person?
No, that's true. That's true. And you're right. It was really more, as Alex says, it was somebody who was trying to come to the realization of who and what he actually was. And a whole lot of things were bubbling up to the surface at various points. Some of them were more helpful than others. Yes.
I think if anybody is trying to just say, well, Uncle Sam said XYZ quote, and we know how, if this means that they disagree or they agree, we can make an assessment. It's like, no, it's from all over the map because he contains these contradictions inside him because that's America. It has the contradictions.
Absolutely.
Something I really love, the notion of reappropriating both Americana and patriotic imagery to support, what for me I would articulate as left ideals. I don't want to put a political ideology in your mouth, but the idea that there's that supporting actual freedom, equality, justice is something that is not at odds with you have in your quotes, like the dream of like what we should have as a country is still very divisive. I don't care about conservative. I'm not talking about conservatives and their delusions. I'm talking about people on the left, whether or not this imagery is salvageable or inherently alienating. So I think it's really bold to just do this from a perspective that is, jumping right in there, and saying we can both use this and critique it. Or at least that's how I read it.
Well, I appreciate that. I think, in the grander scheme of things, and again, keeping in mind, we wrote this 27 years ago now. So, somebody asked me what Uncle Sam was about, and I said, it's a 96-page intervention.
I love it.
Because my God, how there are things and people that we love, but, at the same time, we acknowledge that they are not perfect because no one of us is. And when you encounter the mistakes or the flaws or whatever, and again, it's sort of like if you know somebody who has a drinking problem, you can do one of two things. You can say, I love you so much, I will pretend this doesn't exist. Or you can say, I love you so much that we're going to do everything we can to get you through this and get you to a better place. And that was really kind of the motivation behind Uncle Sam, was that, it wasn't fair to dismiss the ideals of democracy that America purportedly has always meant to represent. Just because on more than one occasion, the mechanisms for implementing those were put into the wrong hands. I think, the line you may be thinking of, Ilana, and it's toward the end is,
yes,
if it was the fault of the dreamers, it wasn't the fault of the dream.
Yes. If America sometimes fouled up along the way and it did that, it was the fault of the dreamers. It wasn't the fault of the dream.
And, we can look at this politician or that one and say, okay, they fell short here or they exceeded expectations there, But as I get older, too, I sort of realize this all comes down to all of us. And that's why, for me, the one line of the book that has resonated the longest with me is the only way to know if freedom works is to work at it,
Yeah, just wish you hadn't have to work so hard.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I know. It's like, what's that Onion headline that a nation longs to care about stupid stuff again? I know
exactly,
that feeling.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the ways that the book also just really is in pulling out symbols from American history past and using them to critique how they've been used in popular culture. Everything from the coonskin hat, the cigar store Indians, and having this sort of floating antiques store.
Oh, the All-American Antiques, yeah.
Yes. What are your thoughts about using these physical symbols that objects to have conversations with objects as a story?
Well, for me, it's like one of the favorite parts of the book is that bringing those figures into life as a physical abstraction. It was so stimulating because it's putting them in the same space they belong in with Uncle Sam and having a very honest, frank, and not so happy conversation about what's the truth behind the history they are part of. And I loved doing those pieces. I knew those were the most dangerous parts of the book, effectively.
I remember Alex had the idea, I think it was Alex who had the idea early on, that Uncle Sam being an iconic representation of a country would probably be able to converse with other icons. So we ran through a bunch of possibilities. I think the idea that he would be interrupted by the Campbell Soup twins came up at one point. That got shot down quickly.
Yeah, that's the only part you could say, honestly. We were told, nope, that's a corporate icon. You can't touch that.
Wow.
But, even to the point of, a cameo by a certain Forest Preserve employed bear.
Yes. Oh my gosh, she made him look menacing. That was intense.
And again, that had to get approved by the Forestry Service, so.
Oh, wow.
Which was fine because there was no denigration of the symbol.
Right.
But obviously other corporations, you weren't going to casually be using their properties for. There's no reason for it, but say if you thought, oh, here's something that Snoopy or Charlie Brown could have represented. Well, that just wasn't good. That was a non-starter.
Yeah.
There,
Yeah.
And as we thought about the points we wanted to make, all of us sort of felt like, these were parts of Americana that, might serve as the gateway for Sam to make certain realizations, and in retrospect, they seem fairly obvious, but at the time it seemed like something that we had to do.
One commonality that I see between all of your work is an interest, all of as in both Alex and Steve, not as in every single thing you've ever done,
sure.
But is an interest in nostalgia, both its appeal and its dangers. And I'm curious about what is it that is compelling to you about nostalgia as source material and as a force to analyze?
I would argue in some ways it's part of a language that you're pulling from. So it's a commonly shared language. And unfortunately, the older we get, the more stuff that we like to pull back to, we don't find common footing with the next generations coming up. But there is so much in the popular culture that we're all sharing that goes back so far. And I love that aspect of the world, that we can reference things from so long ago that prior generations before us had given birth to. So I love to strengthen that with my embrace of those things. That's why in all the work that one could see me do with the corporate superheroes, I love the idea that that's a creative idea born so many decades ago, but it still has a vibrant life and communication to it. And it's communicating ideas that haven't necessarily been disproven or fallen out of use or purpose.
And Alex, I would think, based on what I know of your work, which is a fair amount, part of the nostalgia you might be thinking of here is the fact that this was also a time when these heroes stood for something good. And I mean, I'm not trying to be flip about this, but there's nothing wrong with living in the age of the flawed hero. But when you read a Superman comic 70 or 80 or even 60 years ago, you knew what they stood for. You knew that the idea was, truth and justice. And, you knew that the Fantastic Four were going to be trying to do things for the benefit of humankind.
Right.
And technically those things didn't necessarily change as much as they became more either sophisticated or complicated, which is, of course, the world we find ourselves in.
Fair enough.
But also people have very different knowledge and orientation to it. So like I can write a whole thing, my friend, the late historian Stephen Attewell, wrote a whole thing explaining Captain America as an embodiment of the New Deal Democrats. And then other people are like, oh yeah, he's right wing, which of course I don't think is based in reality. But but people project so much of their own interpretation or misinterpretation of the past in how they read those.
Yeah, I think in my case, what we call nostalgia, to me, that's a part of history. Years ago, when I immersed myself in, the entertainment of the 1930s and 40s, it was a way to learn about this era that my parents and grandparents had lived through. I remember when I first heard, I think it was Fibber, McGee and Molly, and my father said to me, when I was your age, we used to listen to shows like this all the time. And of course, the first thought when you're 12 is, when were you my age?
Right.
That was really eye-opening in the sense that, oh my God, yes, my parents were kids too, and went through a lot of things that all kids go through. And this is how they got their entertainment, and this is how they bought their soap or their cars or their cigarettes, as the case might be. And of course, some of it too, so for me, it's one of those things that it's easier to understand the present, I think, if you know more about the past. And now as what's fascinating to me in the years, especially in the years since Uncle Sam was published, is the digital world has changed the parameters of that to where pretty much every wall that could have existed between one generation and the next, there's a way to knock that down. It's like if you've got somebody who's got 10,000 songs on their phone, they may include Olivia Rodrigo and Taylor Swift, but they may also include Nirvana or the Beatles or Robert Johnson or Duke Ellington. All that stuff's out there, and it's so much easier for a human being to access anything and everything compared to 30 or 40 or 50 years ago.
True, but at the same time, it does seem like these same abilities to open up new ways of connecting generations have allowed just as much of a resource to build up bigger walls to keep people separated from necessarily being involved.
Fair enough. I will say, I remember one story in particular, and I'm not going to... basically, we were out on a vacation one year and staying with friends of the family, and after dinner, a group of people had turned on, I guess, Turner Classic Movies, and there was an old black and white movie on, and one of the teenagers in the family was coming through with his friends and going out and sort of looked over our shoulder. And for argument's sake, we'll say we're watching Duck Soup.
Sure.
So he looks at the screen, sort of like, okay, goes on his way. So the next night, everyone has dinner. People go over to watch Turner again, and another black and white. And again, for the sake of argument, we'll say it's Casablanca. And the same the teenage son comes through again. He looks over his shoulder and he looks at the screen a minute. He says, "Is that movie still on?"
Oof.
But,
it hurt.
yeah, it's true. There was one black and white movie in the 40s, and it was 30 hours long. He's gone on to do good things, so I don't want to.
I'm sure.
Yes, he's actually an exemplary member of his community. But you're right. I mean, obviously, that's one of the flip sides, technologically speaking. Is yes, if you have access to 10,000 songs, or 10,000 movies, or whatever the case may be, you may just stick to downloading the Fast and the Furious franchise and say, "Oh, it's Howard Hawks. Who's that?" Never mind.
Yeah.
I get that.
Well, something you just said that kind of blew my mind, actually, is you were talking about, Steve was talking about, using his becoming interested in learning about radio history because it was connecting to his ideas about his parents. And I know Alex, his mother, was like a really amazing illustrator during the age of illustration being the dominant form of print advertisements. And I'm wondering, like, do we, and I'm including me in this, have an interest in nostalgia because we find our parents interesting? And maybe that's connected to why we have this drive. Because I think a lot of people assume that an interest in nostalgia means you're seeking to go back to an earlier time. And I'm like, no, I like being able to get married to whomever I choose, actually.
Agreed.
But that we all sort of have these sort of connection to stuff from the past. I wonder if it connects to being interested in your parents. I don't know.
Oh, there can be an aspect of that. Absolutely. I think it's a communication across time that has great value, as opposed to seeing one era or your current era as an improvement over whatever came before it, and realizing there's value to be had. There's peaks of creative periods, like just take comic strips as an art form. Mm-hmm. It's active today, but it's not certainly what it was. So you go back 100 years ago and you find that the art form was a real dominant part of the way people interacted with art, and found these phenomenal Sunday strips with the most cutting edge level of graphic art done in print, from Winsor McKay and Little Nemo in Slumberland to eventually Alex Raymond and Flash Gordon, or Hal Foster with Prince Valiant. These things were at a peak, but that peak was so many decades ago. Much of that artistry may have transferred over into other mediums, including comics, obviously. Mm-hmm. But it's beautiful to study these things when they had the greatest value. Say Steve loves radio and radio dramas and radio as a source of entertainment, but you're not going to say the peak of that is now. So it's beautiful to study when art forms were at their zenith.
Yeah, and I think you're right to some degree that it's not necessarily specifically, oh, I want to learn more about my parents. But yes, as you get older, you realize, all the things they went through at 10 or 20 or 40 or 50, whatever the case may be. Mm-hmm. You can have some common ground there. And of course, too, I think part of the interest in nostalgia, if we're using that term, is that it's a sign that there are things in our past that history books don't tell us. I mean, that's one of the things that always fascinated me about radio entertainment was, history textbooks will tell you who fought where, who won what election, what treaty was signed when. They won't tell you, how did we buy our soap? They won't tell you, what did people think was the important thing to know when selling a car? And for that matter, I mean, when you listen to the radio, say from World War II, what was it like to be somewhere in the continental United States while halfway around the world, someone was fighting and you had no idea where or when or how it was going to turn out. And radio was your lifeline to that.
And now, this book also reflects the 90s and the period in which it came out specifically. Like when you go around the prison cell of the people who had been arrested at the same time Uncle Sam was for the disruption, while I wouldn't say that any of the reasons that those people were arrested would not be applicable today. They are especially 90s. You know what I mean? And, as someone who was like an older teenager, when well, at least when I was reading this, so I guess it was probably, or it was out before then. I was a younger teenager, but whatever. It's so wild to me seeing, we've gone past 90s nostalgia. We are now in nostalgia for the early aughts, which is just
wow,
not my aesthetic and wasn't at the time. So very strange for me as well. But I love that this is a piece of that this is now also sort of a piece of historical fiction because of those contemporary scenes and contemporary moments in the book.
Oh yeah. I mean, obviously neither of us had any inkling what the next 25 years would hold, of course. And, I certainly understand, there are things that may fix this in time in that regard, but obviously one likes to think you've written something that will have some resonance beyond its current sell-by date, which was 1997.
But frankly, I think that honestly, we're disappointed to see how much of it holds up with where we are culturally. I think the only difference is you could find in a lot of the artwork to today, maybe some minor fashion differences, but for the most part, I would have just put cell phones in everybody's hands as they're walking down the street. I did it for maybe one or two people in a crowd because that's what I took photos of and saw. But now it's everybody is on a phone, is, controlled by their devices. So that would be the largest visual difference. But much of the content in terms of the struggles of what we're all sort of internally grappling over remains constant.
Yeah, it would have been nice to think, we'll write this and then everything will be ship-shape.
Well, something really prescient with this was that you open with a seemingly homeless person in a hospital being kicked out, and how much of this is about, like, right now we're looking at the criminalization of homelessness by the Supreme Court, supported by people like Gavin Newsom. And the fact that you are looking so directly at the humanity of, because Uncle Sam does interact with actual homeless people in the story who are not symbols. You're looking at homelessness and people being made invisible and being criminalized for it, is really timely now.
Well, I know Alex deserves some credit in the sense that one of the things that we talked about in the very early stages, and he really wanted to make sure this was one of the things we hit in the story, was that, anybody at any level has the potential to contribute. And, the fact that I think in that respect, he really appreciated the fact that our main character was a homeless person, as you point, who happened to also be the spirit of America. It's like, maybe that wouldn't have been the first place people would have thought to look, but there it is nonetheless.
It was the first concept that really came about in our conversations. It was something that I was visualizing. And then when Steve and I just happened in and around, say, 1991 or two, we're talking about interests in what kind of things we thought would be cool to bring into comics, to create an adult comic series around, and thinking of this symbol and interpreting him in this way. That was the first core concept.
That's so interesting. And pretty unique to this too, I think.
Well, I've always said, and Alex may not necessarily agree with me, but his father was a minister, and it wouldn't, I always sort of felt like it's not entirely coincidental that, that he would bring that particular belief to this story, because it's sort of like, he from the get-go was raised to be aware of the world around him and of the people around him.
I don't know if that's a natural thing you get from being, growing up in the church necessarily. It depends on your church, I would imagine. So, we were in the United Church of Christ, which is the far left end of everything. So,
right. But again, but you learned, I would guess, that sort of like, yeah, that person who seems down and out, who seems, on their heels, that doesn't make them any less a human being. It doesn't make them any less a citizen.
Well, it used to be
Yeah.
part of the theory of Christianity is that you were meant to look to those people to help and to elevate and, to recognize their dignity.
I really love this. And the fact that, again, you're emphasizing, I'm Jewish and I grew up going to a lefty Jewish synagogue, basically, that like these are not things that are at odds with each other necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And people make a lot of assumptions otherwise, which actually brings me to Norman Rockwell. I was working one summer at the gift shop of the Corcoran Art Museum when we had a huge Norman Rockwell exhibit happening. And so I got to witness with my own eyes people being very confused about how this artist whose work they most closely associated with like Americana was like also doing work about social tolerance and painted ruby bridges and fighting against bigotry. And like people couldn't reconcile that in their minds. And sometimes I heard like very strong reactions from people in either direction to seeing that. And then I also look at how much, the clear influence of Rockwell and Alex's work. And there's also sort of the similar kind of like push and pull where people make assumptions about a particular art style, maybe. And I don't know if you wanted to reflect on that.
Well, I actually, in a different interview I did earlier this year, I had talking to the interviewer about stuff he had said about me, perfectly kind stuff the person had said about me, made these conclusions about just what my state of faith was. And I thought, well, I really shouldn't correct you because there's a power that comes with that. Because if you think somebody is particularly devout or, because of their being raised this certain way or having a religious figure in their life, like my father being a minister, you assume they've got this potential chip on their shoulder that's either informing their work or is going to be something they're going to be espousing. And I realized I shouldn't necessarily correct your perceptions here just simply because that's almost like a power I can hold over you. You'll approach me with trepidation, which is exactly what I want.
Oh my God. But yeah.
I'm curious, Alana, what you talked about the people at the gift shop, and what kind of reactions were you getting?
There were people who were surprised that Rockwell would be painting quote unquote political art about that was speaking against segregation, and then people who thought that was really cool, and then people who were like felt like they were betrayed that he'd painted this like RFK picture, for example, because that's a Democrat. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, FDR also like worked with him. He's a Democrat too. I also just think that like people have this association between Americana and conservative values. Like that's just, and I'm not saying that's crazy, but that perhaps it's simplistic.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It winds up becoming this weird legacy of omitting a whole part of the history of Rockwell, and that also the history of America in the way that the divisions that seem so pronounced right now weren't. I mean, things were bad in the 60s, to be sure. I'm not discounting that, but I think that there was a fluid nature of how there were certain things we didn't question that we had similar embrace and value of that maybe is even more conflicted at the moment because certain ideas have been weaponized in the time we live in.
Well, one of the other thoughts is, sorry.
Well, I mean, I thought of that recently when the family of the man who was killed in that shooting in Pennsylvania at the rally.
Oh, yes.
And I felt, I mean, obviously felt terrible for the family and for the victim, but then got word that the president had wanted to convey his condolences and the family wouldn't take the call.
She thought her husband would be upset with her if she took the phone call from Biden.
And I mean, I mean, obviously, yeah, people have whatever political beliefs they have, but my gosh, what a shame that
Yeah.
somebody who actually wanted to reach out for no purpose other than to convey, sympathy,
Yeah.
and you could not bring yourself to accept that for whatever reason. That's so tragic. Your
It's
deceased
like,
husband.
it took me a minute to remember, this thing that just happened, because the past week has felt like a year. So
Okay, well, and then
Oh,
I'm like, whoa,
okay.
that's bleak. That's bleak.
I mean, again, like I say, people have whatever politics they have, and but again, you're right. It's very sad to think that this that you were going to draw a line as to which condolences you could accept. I just thought that was
Right.
terribly sad.
Yeah. Yeah. I also wanted to talk about sort of realism and photorealism as an artistic discipline. In film, when we talk about the Italian neorealists, a lot of that is sort of assumed to be people using the tools of realism to do a criticism of the reality as people experience it or experienced it in those moments. And I think that I feel like I haven't heard a ton of conversation about the choice that you make as an artist to focus on like photorealism and what that has to say about your worldview. Because I have a theory, but Lord knows I don't want to put that in your words. So I do, because I feel like there is a connection here, but I don't know if you want to elaborate on that.
Oh, wow. Towards a worldview. I don't know if I've got a ready answer for that. I would love to hear your theory on what my worldview is, and then I could actually clarify for you.
Fair enough. I think that, there's a humanism that runs throughout your work, whether it's Marvel's, right? And I think that, there's many different ways to try to illustrate that humanism, but trying to show humanism by showing people faces that there's no like line between you and them that's abstracted, and that it's sort of celebrating the material reality of people in some way. Even if oftentimes faces are idealized, that they're often less idealized than some of the more simplified superhero work can have, in fact. So I think it sort of like relates to your humanism, and this sort of celebration of like how people look and feel and emote physically in the real world. So like when I'm seeing that doctor very early in the book feeling really guilty that he can't do more for Uncle Sam, like I don't know that I would have had that same reaction in a more abstracted piece of work when I look at that face.
Oh, good. I mean, and the help of that is that the model is a particularly good one to build off of. In that particular case, our friend who posed for me, Lennon Del Sol, I wasn't rewriting the features of his face, whereas so many of the other characters I may have had to choose to do that with, like Uncle Sam himself. But I've based a lot of my work from the earliest to the latest with specific focuses on what individual people have given me, like the lead characters of both Marvels and Kingdom Come are based upon, one was a friend of ours and another was my father. And the age of the person was of particular appeal because of just the grit of that you could get so much pathos and so much life coming through. You're reading so much more into a face when you're not idealizing it or removing the aspects of age. You're actually drilling down into those things. I found incredibly inspiring and would really imbue the work with a lived-in quality that you felt more drawn into the narrative, drawn into the people. I mean, this is what has worked, of course, when there's casting that works really well with bringing, fictional characters to life. If it feels like it's the right person, it can really, deepen the work in some cases, not every time, but in my work, it was a particular driving inspiration to use people and to let their human faults even collide with maybe sometimes the idealization of what I was putting the characters, the model through. Like the friends who I've turned into superheroes, I'd be enhancing their musculature in some cases, not all, because I've known some fit people.
Mine a lot.
Steve was the model for the character Elongated Man in everything I've ever drawn for DC Comics.
I love that.
Yeah.
And that also included an older version of Steve seen in the series Kingdom Come, where the head of the stretching neck and head of Elongated Man appears in multiple scenes. So, but I love the fact that I was drawing age into these idealized characters' faces, age that was greater than the models who were friends of mine, who were sometimes between their 20s and their 30s at the time I used them. And certainly, when I was drawing my father as the lead character, the sort of narrative figure of Kingdom Come, I was just putting in my dad because I knew he was this great looking preacher figure who looked like Obi-Wan Kenobi, and that was going to play really well.
Yes.
All those lines in his face were a delicate map of distinction that was something you weren't seeing in every other form of comics or entertainment in general. And I still find myself drawn to older faces. And one of the things I have enjoyed actually in a lot more televised dramas than film is when you've got older actors now getting cast more and more in things, or people that, are celebrities who were young in the 90s that are still working today. I love the fact you're still seeing these faces that have so much more character in them now.
Mm-hmm.
They're so much more fun to depict, and also challenging. This is so funny. I've recently begun doing more figurative gouache painting.
Oh.
And particularly with an interest in, for the first time actually, because when I was younger and I took drawing seriously, I wasn't interested in depicting older people. I just did not care. Now I'm like fascinated by trying to capture the emotion and the lines that people have on their face is a product of the facial movements that they make, right? And, admittedly, generally speaking, I'm drawing good-looking older people. Okay. But that there is something more interesting as an artist to make this than there is with something I'll draw somebody and I'm trying to make them younger, and now I'm giving them too many lines because they like the way it looks. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, actually they're supposed to look 45 or 50, but they did. Oh, well. It's fun.
And it's actually been a little bit of a source of conflict in some cases. Not too much. I've gotten to draw pretty much everything the way I've wanted to draw it for the companies I've worked for. But my older Superman in a narrative where he's meant to be older seemed fine. But when I was really just transporting that over into other books I did involving Superman, various cover paintings, as well as story content with him, there would be, if not pushback, there would be this sort of second guessing of aren't you making him a bit heavier and, weightier and maybe a little bit too, not necessarily lived in, but more middle-aged than what ideally was the standard. And of course, I could always point towards the past and say, I'm making him look like that sort of Charles Atlas body type that was the ideal from the 1930s. And the way I was drawing it connected the first version of the character. So for me, it seemed young by that comparison. But there would be that thing of the push towards male models that you see with pretty much most of the casting that's happened in the last 40 years. And I'm going to blame Chris Reeve here for setting a new standard for the character. When you hired him all those years ago, even I, as an 8-year-old kid, when that movie came out, thought, he's good, but seems a little young, a little pretty. I was used to a harder looking man who was objectively middle-aged, being Superman. And now we were getting a 20-something. And it felt like that to me as a young reader. And I had enough perception of the history that had already been chronicled at that point in the 70s to notice that difference. So I'm going to blame Chris Reeve for all the pretty Superman who have ever come.
Oh my.
Well, I mean, at least he looks like he's eaten food. I mean, what upsets me now is people are so, the standard is supposed to be so dehydrated and so pumped up on medication. It's not that's not even a healthy body anymore. That is a dehydrated, tragic body. And at least in at least in Reeves' period, it's he's in better shape than anyone I know, but he's certainly eaten the sandwich. Like, I don't get the sense that that he's like torturing himself for this. And it's finding it sort of painful to look at the standards that they try to use now. It's like, that's no way to live. That's no way to live.
It's interesting that of course, the biggest Superman before Christopher Reeve was George Reeves.
Yes, no relation. Isn't that weird?
No relation, but I mean,
so weird.
But he was one of those, as Alex points out, one of those Charles Atlas-y figures. He was sort of, you looked at George Reeves on the Adventures of Superman television show, that guy's rock solid.
Well, for him, it's mostly to do with the shape of his skull. He had a big square head that had this certain kind of impression that it made, even though he wasn't like straight up an exact adaptation of the drawings like Chris Reeves seemed to be. There was something magical going on there with his casting and his performance. So, I mean, his Clark Kent is my favorite Clark Kent because it's not the bumbling one or the one desperately trying to hide his, a hero under a bushel. He was basically a reporter doing reporter work who had a lot of forcefulness and kind of bullishness in the way he did his job. If you ever had bothered to watch that series, you'd see this is the original Clark Kent, the way that a lot of us thought of him from generations before.
Right. And one who sort of realizes, you know what? Yes, I'm living with all these people who don't have the powers and abilities I do. And man, it's great. It's a hoot, And, this comes back to something that I was really trying to articulate earlier, and that's with a lot of Alex's work, obviously people are impressed by the realistic quality of it. But I think there is also a human quality to it. And as part of that, and if you look at any book Alex has ever done, whether it's Uncle Sam or the 4 books he did with Paul Dini or Full Circle, his characters, the heroes of these books, they're doing good things. That's, and I think maybe it has an extra resonance when you can look at Reed Richards or Clark Kent or Uncle Sam and say, yeah, that's a human being just like you and I. And look at what they're doing. They're putting all their talents to use for the purpose of doing good.
It's trying to elevate the value of, virtuous deeds and the idea of doing good things for no other reason than they're good.
What is now, I know a little bit about your history as a developing, as an artist, Alex, but like, why paint comics as opposed to, now, you're doing drawing with, Full Circle, but just like, why using painting as the medium for this sort of visual storytelling that prior to you?
I took it to that level of like really mainstreaming it, meaning that there was a lot of painted series and graphic novels that had come out before.
The epic stuff from Marvel,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. And you had people like enormously talented people like Dave McKean, Bill Sienkiewicz, Kent Williams,
John Muth.
A long, long list of talents that came in and did stuff within the realm of it, but they would often be fairly shy about doing superheroes fully. Almost in such a way as they knew that once they started to approach it with a level of realism, as many of their works contained, that it would start to seem inherently, absurd to them, maybe as individuals, that they weren't as into selling it. Whereas I was fully committed to wanting to sell the reader on the practicality and believability of these characters and even their unreality being reality. And I wanted to convince people of that. And of course, that means that's the main selling point for the companies. They've got all these colorful superheroes. They want you to buy into them, but they were pretty much mostly selling them through abstract kind of representation. Certainly at the peak of, the start of the 90s with the art styles that dominated that time period. So there was me, and there was other people like Joe Jusko, who did a series of card illustrations that were realistic interpretations of characters. So I was certainly never alone in this pursuit, but I might have been the most single-minded person in terms of trying to drill down into it, who was willing to put all parts of his life on hold for the sake of doing project after project that was committed to hey, look at this group of characters looking realistically. And it was a delight because it was also a way for me to engage with friends like Steve who would participate as collaborators and models. And those human beings would imbue the work with just their lending a hand. And it would feel that much more grounded and inspirational. And I know I was tapping into a market of what a lot of the audience desired, whether they knew it or not. So I was one of those people, and it worked thus far.
I have to say, that's one of the things I remember about Uncle Sam is that it was one night, Alex, when you came over to our apartment when we were more or less neighbors at that time. And there was the scene at the senator's victory party. And we just needed crowd members, and people who could, stand and applaud. And it was almost like, hey, call all your friends and bring them over. And when we did, and we got 4 or 5 people. And, I've always sort of said half jokingly, Ilana, that Alex's work for me is like a really outstanding community theater.
Oh.
Because as he says, he calls on a lot of our mutual friends. So it's sort of like I can read through it and be impressed by the story and the art, but I can also say, oh, there's Mark. Oh, there's Nancy. Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
See her.
Yeah.
Do
you ever think about doing as an add-on to one of the books, like some of the photos like that you're using as reference?
We've only shown them sparingly in various kind of behind the scenes looks into my work, like coming out sometime after, not much time after Uncle Sam comes out here from Abrams, we'll have a re-release of the Fantastic Four book with a kind of behind the scenes deep dive book. It's an oversized printing of it where it's like an artist edition that shows every page of penciled work, every page of ink work without the color applied, and then a lot of the photo reference I took. But there also is the limitation of I moved into a place where I had so many kind of more comical or abstract characters that I wasn't necessarily needing to use as many friends for the grounding that, certainly inhabits something like Uncle Sam. So the only model that participated was me. I shot photos of myself doing every pose for every gender, every group, and just, altered the figures and faces. And I work with a lot of statues, toys, and whatever reference else. But, there's only so much that my previous models want to see me sharing those photos. They were kind enough to lend their time with. So I would have to reach out to each and every individual person to clear that with them should we be showing much more of it.
I hear that. But yeah, I just think it's such an interesting part of the process. Well, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the importance of making art on paper right now and, doing water media and making art on paper.
Well, for me, it might be just more of a personal thing in terms of the engagement with the work. I don't know, since I've never worked on a computer and I literally do not know how to type, so I don't send emails practically. I write stuff down and then hand it off to my wife to send for me. So I am a definite Luddite in the most official way you can be. But I appreciate the speed and the ease that people get from using digital materials, but I like the practical contact I make with a physical object that I know a lot of people talking about using digital materials the way that either a stylus or a fingertip on a screen doesn't give the same sense of using a practical tool they might have been trained with, using a pencil, a paintbrush, or what have you. And all the light that I have bouncing back to my eyes is not electronic light directly pointed at me. It's the bounce light from natural light in my office or the lights over my table. So does that mean I'm going to have less, whatever that negative effect might be? I have no clue, but I appreciate the experience and the engagement with paper. And I figured I'm too old at this point to learn anything new. I don't want to learn new things. I'm against learning new things. So I want to make it to the end without really doing any kind of a computer adjustments because I can entrust somebody else to do that for me.
Right, right. But I think people are just so dazzled by it still, which I think is valuable as well. Because they don't make it, and people are so removed from art making in certain ways now.
And you might have heard this, maybe you didn't, but that the art school that trained me, my mother, and had reached just 100 years last year, it just closed.
No. Oh, man.
In fact, they should be clearing out of the building today, here on the 31st day, because I believe by August 1st, they were supposed to be getting out of their building on Michigan Avenue. So, lower enrollments, COVID, all those things that have hurt every college in America, devastated my school. And now that particular education that was so valuable to me isn't available for the next generation.
That stinks. Because I do some online videos and stuff like that, and I have gained tiny bits of things, but it's nothing like what I was able to get doing in-person art classes as a young person. That's a real loss.
Yeah. And I know that certain aspects of it will be there in other places. I mean, the key thing I felt I got the biggest jump from more than any other single class was working from a live model every day. So if people can find that resource within their various community park districts that might have art classes you can go to, either pay or maybe there's even free uses of a paid model that people like Steve's wife, Meg, who have modeled for, how long has Meg been modeling for, Steve?
Oh, gosh, about 35 years.
Okay. Yeah. As long as I've known her. Yeah.
And, and there's no substitute for that. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, we'll put a Ken doll on this table and everyone draw it. But that's not the same. Again, to come back to what you all were discussing earlier, that, you're getting the lines, you're getting the eyes and whatever look is in those eyes,
Yeah. And there's so much about the structure of the human body that even I'm coasting on knowledge I gained from 35 years ago that I'm applying to other reference and things where I'm filling in the gaps of what I think I know, when in fact, my facility for how well I hold on to retention of the shape of form and the way to draw it or paint it, it can dissipate. It can get weaker over time if I don't kind of reinvigorate that connection to life. And I never expected I would not use people again directly as a resource. I've just found it easy in some ways to show, here's how I naturally draw, and here is it applied with a certain amount of quick reference I can get on my own without begging friends to pose for me for free again and again. But, that direct resource and engagement with life, it's what fills you up. And in more ways than one, I would think, for me as a young artist coming to Chicago, within the first week of drawing from a live model, I thought, oh, I may have something here, because everything I'd drawn freehand up to that time, now I've got this extra help of a real form in front of me there. And my translation of that to the paper satisfied me to think, oh, it's not like throwing me off. It's giving me more, that's tightening me up, that's filling my head, and I'm recording as I'm going along. I'm making a mental library of how to handle all that's there in life and report it back down in the way that I translate it.
I listened to a really interesting interview that you did on the Off Panel podcast, and you were talking about Jack Kirby. I'm a huge Jack Kirby fan, by the way. I have a half sleeve of Jack Kirby tattoo art on my arm. So
oh my heavens, okay.
I've done a lot of events with the museum. Like, I'm a Kirby head.
Would you tell me what the art is of?
Oh yeah, it's all kind of Supertown, Big Barda. I've got Mother Box, a gauntlet that he drew, and just some pieces from his own individual work that's not even from comics.
Wonderful!
With more to come. I say this just to say that, like, something that you said that I just think really struck me was you said, I can't be walking into another situation like Kirby and Lee where the art is considered subjugated to the writing, and mentioned how people are still, arguing. I mean, Lord knows I've been in those internet debates, like over like who to credit for what. And I mean, what I love with you guys is like working together as partners and that sort of being built into the teamwork. But I do also suspect that part of the reason that so many people both in the comics, readers and certain people who work in publishing, frankly, I think undervalue art is because of their lack of arts education. People seem to be able to go to school and not learn anything about art. And sometimes that shows up in the ways you will see comics reviews that won't talk about the visuals. Or, in your interview, you talked about like the way that they, like artists are not necessarily trusted to do their own writing. It's insulting and strange. And kind of the only justification I can think of it is like people don't understand art.
That's got to be part of it. But the other part is who is going behind the scenes to be in charge, to hire, to be the editors and be the publishers. They're almost always active or former writers or wannabe writers. So there's been kind of this leadership coming from the top of like this job that arguably is done in less time, a lot less time, that's coming from the ones who have seen their own value as I conceive the thing, and then this other person who does this art thing, they just articulate, they carry out my idea, but the idea is the thing. And it's an argument that gets caught up in a lot of people's misunderstanding of how much there is thinking going on and planning and invention going on with every little stroke of an illustration, let alone of storytelling in comic books. So when you actually get into understanding how much each artist is contributing to what they're following, even as just a given assignment, there's so much invention there that it's horrible to see that basically the people who are often delivering an analysis of this or just hiring and choosing who gets to be in charge of things is coming from the writer's perspective. And all the editors I deal with and have dealt with in the past are all either active writers or former writers or wannabe writers. And I hate them all.
I wonder too if it might be because where the big two are concerned, at least Marvel and DC, the assembling of a comic book can be kind of piecemeal. It's sort of I've always had for nearly all of my comic book career, and I'm putting that in quotes. I've known going in who the artist was going to be. Obviously, Alex and I were conceiving Uncle Sam 5 years before it came out. So there was no doubt in either of our minds who was working on that with us. And as a result, both as a collaborator and as a friend, we could have conversations about what's going to look good, what's going to read well. Obviously, the editors will have some input on that too. When I did Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, I think I'd written 5 issues before I knew that it was going to be drawn by Jonathan Lau. And Jonathan did a great job. But it also meant that I'd written half the story before I'd really had a chance to communicate with the artist and say, okay, what about this works? What about it doesn't? And I think I would guess a lot of writers might find themselves in that position, and a lot of artists might too, in the sense that, okay, draw these 18 pages. Who's writing it? We don't know.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of setup started at the infancy of the comic industry, where you would think that the artist-writer kind of being a single person entity would have carried over from comic strips directly into comic books. But then there was the intention of you got to keep giving a new product to that potential audience every visit that they've, in that case, coming back to a newsstand. You want to keep their eyeballs on your particular thing. So to get that schedule met, you keep needing making a new product. Then it was monthly. Sometimes, well, obviously there was weekly product being made, but still, to reach that goal, you have to cut up the process to have it by as many different hands to be done as quickly as possible. And of course, you had the great goal there was not necessarily about embrace of a single artist perspective, but creating a stylized look for your property that can be run by a studio where the main artist can oversee the other person's work working under them. And much like Joe Shuster did with Superman, once they got it off the ground, he's got a whole team of guys drawing the stories, which then, as they're going to final, he's going through and drawing the heads on all the final figures so that they have that consistent look of his hand.
Right.
So they're following his lead of the kind of cartooning he was doing. And it all unifies. And that was going on in comic strips as well. You can find details of that going on back to that time period, including with, strips like Little Abner and Al Cap, where it became a mill. And that reduces some of that individuality and unique contribution that a singular perspective an artist can give.
Yeah, definitely. And I just wish people were more able to talk about the art, since that's why a comic is a comic as opposed to a prose novel or the like. One thing I hadn't remembered, but that really smacked me immediately when I began reading the book now, was how much Chicago, how this is such a Chicago book, Sam. And I know you live there, right? But what is the significance of Chicago as the location for this story?
I'm not sure that was a deliberate choice as such, in the sense that we weren't necessarily thinking, oh, the street will be lined with Chicago Bulls fans, anything like that. I think it was just a case of finding a city we knew, finding streets we knew. I remember one of the things Alex and I had to talk about, and we all did. I think Karen Berger got into this as well. But we were always reminded that we could dirty things up. Alex had done Marvels and Kingdom Come, and he, of course, had become justly famous for these marvelous, realistic, idealized heroes. And Uncle Sam was, in so many respects, the absolute antithesis of that. And Alex, I don't remember what your memory is on this, but I think we were all very encouraging in the sense of, okay, make this person look even more downtrodden, make them look even more despondent.
Right.
It wasn't like, and I think it may have just been a learning curve, but also because I also have very vivid memories of. Alex, I don't know if you'll remember this, but we actually got on the Dan Ryan Expressway one day, and we drove to Indiana.
Oh, yeah.
And to Calumet City, and the south, basically the very southern part of Illinois, which becomes Indiana, because that's where all the factories were.
Yes, it was so I could take a photo out the window, and I believe you must have been driving.
I'm
couldn't
sure
have been doing both.
We're still here to tell the story, so I must have been, yeah.
Yeah, and I was taking a photo of smokestacks that appear in one of the pages that is composed of panels that are vignettes of various ills happening in America, and those panel shapes are all states. So we do that twice or three times in the series, I forget.
Something like that. 3 or 4,
yeah,
I don't remember. But
we wanted to have a representation of those kind of smokestacks. I don't remember which state we put that one into, but there was some pointed commentary that was meant to apply to certain regions, certainly. But that was one of them. And we put in the time and
yeah. And I don't think the
drive.
Yeah, I don't think it being a Chicago book was necessarily deliberate. I think it's just more a case of, we wanted a place that could have great beauty and also great sorrow and to some degree squalor. Not that we're reveling in the squalor or anything like that, but just, Chicago, like a lot of major metropolitan cities, is one where you can see amazing landmarks and also, again, turn around and be greeted by homeless people.
Well, we were also not wanting it to be clear through most of the series that there was, I call it a series because it was 2 issues back then, that there was so specifically Chicago in much of what he's traveling through. We were kind of leaving it in mind that like he himself is seeming to travel through time, and he may be traveling through different cities, that if you were filming this, you wouldn't necessarily pick a single city to shoot in. And that there could be aspects of this feeling like New York here or Cleveland there, and
or Oklahoma City in 1935. Yeah.
So it is obviously very much a given when you have these very key moments, like the last page of the book of this graphic novel is showing Chicago comics on Clark Street, and that's by Clark and Belmont. And I thought, well, it could have been anywhere I was showing in any part of the city. Why not make it especially real so that I'm not making up any building fronts? But when I was doing other scenes where you've got, like, say, an alleyway that he's camping out in, well, I tried to shoot various building edifices that I could translate for that. But I may have been uninformed enough to show something that looks so distinctly Chicago because of the way it's set up that it can't possibly be this or that other city. It has to be where we are. And I just don't know any better by the details I was translating. I can give another example of this. Is like in just a couple years after that, the next graphic novel, one of the next graphic novels I did was a one-shot Batman book called War on Crime, where in the first few pages, I draw what's supposed to be a Gotham City police officer, where the patch I put on the side of the person's jacket that he was not wearing at the time, I just researched a book on cops and it just happened to show some markings on the person's jacket. And I took it as thinking it was a Chicago, or as a police specific branding, but in fact it was the Chicago flag. And I had no idea what our city flag was. And I wound up putting it into this Batman book as if it represented Gotham City.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
I was going to say something along those lines. Forgive me while I try to catch my thoughts here. I don't know if you've ever seen Brazil.
Yes. Big fan.
Terry Gilliam's films, absolutely marvelous. And one of the visual inspirations from that film for me is at the very end of the film. So spoiler alert for those of you who've not seen this film from 40 years ago, where Jonathan Pryce is in the back of the truck and Kim Greist is driving him purportedly to safety. And, you see from Jonathan Pryce's view, this beautiful blue sky with clouds in the background. And you're just, happy ending. He's gotten away. And then Michael Palin's head pops into the frame. Mm-hmm. It's like, nope. You're still here. And that was one of the visual inspirations for me, was the sense that, as Alex points out, this character is going through all different sorts of things and all different sorts of places. So it could be a situation where, you're standing in an alleyway, and if you look one way, you see a brick wall. And if you turn to the right, you see you're in the middle of the Dust Bowl. That's how the reality was shifting. There was actually in the 90s, and I wish I could credit the director. I don't remember who it was, but there was a television presentation of Gulliver's Travels during this time. And there was a fair amount of that in there because Ted Danson as Lemuel Gulliver is clearly trying to explain that he's not insane and all these things did happen to him. And a lot of that is, yes, he's in the jail cell 1 minute, but if he looks, if he looks at the bars, that's great. And if he turns around, suddenly he's with the Lilliputians, That was that sort of constantly shifting reality that we were really striving for.
Was the double talk section also reflecting They Live, where you have the corrupt politician speaking and you hear what he's really saying?
It wasn't. I'm afraid I have to plead ignorance on They Live. I've heard it's a great film.
It's so good, yeah. Cool. I'm just curious. That's all good.
No, it was just one of those, we would not be the first people, I'm sure, to think that politicians of a certain stripe speak in code that,
yes.
That like the stuff they throw out to the red meat they throw out to their followers, and then what they really mean. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. But to the Chicago and Illinois thing, I mean, your book got me Googling the Black Hawk War.
Right.
And, right. Which is like one of the great things is like, there's so many pieces of important history that you're either reminding or informing people of, but, Black Hawk War, like that's totally, Illinois is one of the key places there. And you have the setting with the World's Fair in Chicago in particular lending itself. I sort of liked Haymarket. Like I liked that it kind of kept popping back into this like big city in the middle of the country. Relatively in the middle. I live in New York, so it's closer to the middle than I am. I know it's not really in the middle. But I actually should ask, I know you guys credit Howard Zinn, later in the book as one of the inspirations. How did you decide which historical incidents you wanted to frame the story with? Because there's so many you could possibly be using to tell a story like this.
Yeah, I think it had a lot to do with where the story was going to go, and if we went with the idea that, Uncle Sam as an icon was conversant with other icons, well, that might include the cigar store Indian. And if it does, then, can we find an example of, mistreatment of the Native Americans at the hands of the settlers?
Not hard to find them, but you found a particularly interesting
surprisingly
one.
Easy. Yeah.
Whereas by contrast, when you do the thing with the lynching aspect and relating that to the
Amadei Ardwan.
Yeah. Well, right. But given how intimate that was, and it wasn't related to, wiping out an entire group of people like, the Black Hawk incident, it remarks towards a much greater regularity of how intimate that experience was for that person suffering. But of course, how widespread that was, how repeated that was, that lynching was not a thing that happened a few times. It happened as almost a constant threat.
Oh, yeah. And as almost as in certain states as almost a tourist attraction, which is horrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think with some of those things, Ilana, that it was a case of, we had a point we wanted to make, and I don't remember if it was in Howard Zinn's book or another source that we got some of the actual words of Black Hawk at the time of his surrender, but they struck me as so powerful that
yes,
I just felt we have to include these. And that's the sort of thing where, it wasn't like Nicholas Nickleby where he's asked to adapt Romeo and Juliet to include a wash tub because the company just got a wash tub. But it was definitely a case of, what were the points we wanted to make, who were the characters or the icons we wanted to use, and what was a good fit for those. I think actually I may have learned about Amadei Ardwan, the Cajun musician, through Linda Barry, because she told his story, I think, in one of her books. It may have been The Good Times Are Killing Me. I don't remember. But just one of those things that, as Alex points out, that was all too common. The fact that we put a specific name to it, we didn't necessarily have to, let's put it that way, because there were plenty of people who go unnamed who encountered the same thing.
I really liked the choice to do a specific person's name and story, though.
I'm glad.
And someone who wasn't famous, it's powerful.
Yeah, I thought so too. I mean, like I say, it was a story that broke my heart when I read it. And I was very fortunate in that I was doing this book with Alex, because I knew, where we had reference material, he would take it, he would absorb it. Where we didn't, he would look for it. And, I knew when it came to presenting something vivid, whether it was vivid in a heroic sense or vivid in a horrifying sense, that's what we would get.
I cried multiple times reading this. And, I think that sometimes audiences can be divided over like how you depict traumatic, violent, terrible things in terms of what you show and what you don't. I think everything is done really sensitively and well. But so how did you figure out the right balance and how to give the dignity to everybody and have it not feel like cheap or shocking?
Well, I'd like to think that you don't want to expose your love of wallowing in human misery and the beautification of extreme violence. So obviously a lot of entertainment, comics, and what have you is built around such. But, the acknowledgement of issues of hurt and, like if I'm going to draw blood, I always want to make sure it looks like the darkest thing as opposed to a vibrant red. But in fact, this thing that is so deep and dark. And when you see it, you hopefully will see it in one of my illustrations. It's like, ooh, that is actual blood, or feel that it is, that it feels grounded and not pleasant to have to witness, that you don't just take it as like a little bloody nose on your hero's face or something simple like that you take it as upsetting, and to acknowledge certain ills, awful things like even rape, which is illustrated in one sense in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It is done in such a removed kind of way, or the intimacy of the hurt is what's displayed, not the chance that you're creating in any way a stimulating visualization of such. Because I think that's the problem of getting into representing those things, is that the very nature of their inclusion almost invites a kind of visceral reaction that can be the wrong reaction. So I wanted to walk that fine line of acknowledging all the things that we wanted to show hurt for, but not embracing any of that with a sense of like, well, I'm really getting in there with, I'm loving to show this. I know as an illustrator who draws grown men in tights punching each other all the time, that visualization has to have a certain amount of kick or follow through to it, that has connectivity of feeling like you showed an action with some kinetic force. Not much of that inhabits this work, certainly not in a stimulating way. And in fact, look at the conclusion of our book and see that we're showing the hero character taking a beating from the other character, his counterpart, and it's not done to say, well, look at how awesome this violence is. It's to say, in a way, this is not a solution. This doesn't get us anywhere.
No, you're right. It's violence out of rage and desperation, and there's really nothing appealing about that. Although,
just as I said that, I have to conclude with we did close with one shot of. It's an undershot done in a very stylistic way, typical to comics, of you're underneath the flying figure of Uncle Sam as his back is to us, taking a headshot from his counterpart, where that guy looks almost heroically placed, throwing the punch, and our hero is thrown back up in wild. I mean, this is a very Neil Adams-y kind of composition.
Yes.
So. Realistically, is that glorifying violence? Yeah, probably.
Well, but then you hopefully look at what's being said and at the same time. This is where the collaborative aspect, I think, becomes apparent, that I knew Alex could draw a terrific fight scene. He knew it, of course, he did it. But, if then it comes down to, as a writer, your responsibility is to show audiences as much of this character doing the punching as you can. And at that point, we were trying to convey, if all you're doing is going after, if all you do is think you're going to throw a series of punches and carry the day and win again, that's not how this fight works. And when a character is in that position where that thing which has always been their their go-to, their saving grace, isn't there for them, then one of two things happens. But in this case, yes, they get more angry and more desperate. And then by the time that scene is over, the heroic looking one is actually the cowardly one.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, in terms of some of the scenes you're talking about, we knew we had a lot of ground we wanted to cover. And one of the advantages of those pages that Alex is referring to, where it's all those little snapshots, is it means you can just do one moment, you represent it artistically, you hopefully offer some representation verbally, you move on. I think had we done any of those scenes and extended them out to 2 or 3 pages, yes, it would have been horrifying and not really in a good way.
Right. It's just it's a glimpse. There's so much innovative paneling in this, and it's funny because I love full circle. I mean, of course, but like I think some people just hadn't really realized that kind of creative paneling work from Alex is not just a new thing. that's also in Uncle Sam as well.
And it's probably borrowed in many ways from the likes of Neil Adams. I mean,
Sure.
I think he was the first artist to really push dynamic angling and really breaking up the traditional grid of comic book pages. I was also translating a lot of the things I saw done in painted work, like from Dave McKean, where there was a lot of very long, rectangular panels that had a certain kind of graphic impact upon me as a reader reading his work for the first time with a series called Black Orchid that came out in 1989.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that work had a seminal impact upon my 19-year-old self, where I just thought, okay, I want this, but with more superheroes, and I guess I can figure out how to make that happen.
Then I do want to speak briefly then about Fantastic Four Full Circle. I adore Jack Kirby, as I've established, and I would never have guessed that you working with Jack Kirby so directly would have made sense as well, like artistically as this did. I mean, you invented this whole other planet that is completely, it's like Jack Kirby art directed it, but it's fully rendered in your style, but also drawn instead of painted. What is it like? Like, of course you're inspired by Kirby. Basically everybody is, but what is it like trying to integrate so many specific design elements into your work when you're like you did in this book?
Well, it's an obsession, and it's probably unhealthy because it gets a little bit too focused at a certain point where I need to break from that Kirby influence, which has been heavy in my life from pretty much day one, because I was able to when I was first getting comics in 1974, 75, Jack's were some of the first works I was getting, and we still actively making comics for Marvel and DC at that time. Mm-hmm. So lifelong influence, one of my first artists I would ever come to know by name. But as I get older, I get more obsessed with him. I get more interested in him. I already was as a child. I only become more enamored, and then trying to take what I do and find the hybrid of how I feel that there's a reality that is inhabiting Jack's hand that I think can lend itself to more direct representation. I also don't feel that he was so far removed from such, literal lifelike representation. So I felt that he has large periods of his work that weren't terrifically abstract. They were just pushing, graphically, the way you could position figures, the way you could present the dynamism of life. And I like trying to filter all of that energy, all the pop art stuff he did going from the 60s into the 70s. I like to filter that into, and that's where this Fantastic Four book was a love letter to his work, his life, and his complete takeover of my brain in many ways. So I've spent more time than any other artist directly in my influence, trying to I didn't want to say regurgitate, but I'm not finding a better word. Regurgitate that influence back out in a way that shows what it inspired me with. And so much of the time it's taking images that Jack did and then, oh, but how would that look painted? So it's fairly simple-minded in some ways.
I mean, it's not simple. It's not simple-minded, but it's just shocking how well it works. Like I really loved this, and I did not necessarily know that it would be this good until I got it in my hands. So but I definitely, I see, like, with the covers you were doing, some of the covers for like the Hulk book, like you're really interested in playing with different. There's like more body horror kind of emerging as a theme in some of the visuals, and just this sort of, I don't know. It feels like there's a lot of different ways you're trying to apply your style, as you're making new work today.
Well, that actually does reflect some of the direction I was given. So in say the case of the body horror in that particular book, that was the course of where the book was set on, which was a really unique one applied to the character for the first time in a long while. And I got to be part of that, whereas the artist of the book, Joe Bennett, he did so much more with that than I was able to accomplish in the paintings. So there was a continuity of what the writer Al Ewing was after and the direction he was, giving to us. And I just wanted to make sure whatever I was doing, that it looked like a Kirby style Hulk, the one that he created back in '62. So I wanted to get that across more than any other visual need on my part. And I could almost be asked to do anything after that, as long as I was getting that one need met. And recently I saw the term body horror applied to at least one image I did for the cover of a Fantastic Four comic book.
Yeah.
And
I know the one you mean, yeah.
Do you know the one?
Right.
Well, which one do you think I mean?
Oh,
I think it involves eating Reed Richards' face.
Yes, that's what I assumed.
Oh, well, great. That's actually not what I meant, but that's the one that I believe is currently on the stands right now as we speak.
Yes.
And I think it is my second to last cover. So, but there was a cover that had the writer had intended to show the perception of the group from a completely alien point of view. So for a non-human species seeing this group of characters with this body distortion, and where they didn't necessarily recognize the human form, how it might be interpreted into their minds, what they might be seeing. So I did this very abstracted kind of form of Reed Richards is like a walking circulatory system. So no bones, no flesh, just this seemingly disembodied head made of nothing but and arms and legs walking forward, but they're just, the veins of the body exposed and animated themselves. And the rock form of the thing was much more like it was generated by AI on its worst day. So these kind of weird representations of the group was it was dubbed body horror in an article that was sent to me. And I found that very interesting, because I'm becoming just familiar with the term now and thought, yeah, sure, I was after that.
Sorry, because I was looking at that new Blood Hunt cover was the one I was thinking of. I actually don't know if I've seen the one you're describing, but I definitely want to check that out.
Yeah, it was a little while back, but the new one, it's just ironic because it sort of relates to how I feel with the particular face style of Jack Kirby's Reed Richards, and how I feel that it may not. I mean, it was fitting for the need of the vampire storyline that I was being told to create an image for, and I want to do a close-up like that with him, but the sort of pushing and pulling his face like taffy kind of, it also captures the way that I feel that the casting of Reed not necessarily matching what Jack laid out has been an issue I found with Hollywood in its entire adaptation of these characters, that if you don't get that exact to the page, the way that Jack laid it out for you, then you've lost the whole thing for me. But that's an opinion I could revise in the future. You never know.
So I know we're coming up on our cold time out, and I want to say again, I appreciate you both spending so much time with me. This is going to be fantastic. Is there anything that I have not asked you yet that I should have?
Oh,
every now and then somebody's like, "Oh yeah, we got to tell you about this thing we have coming out in 3 weeks that wasn't in the press release," and I'm like, "Oh, tell me about that." Or sometimes it's things of that nature, but
I can think of a certain thing to say related to maybe historically what's lost to time now because it doesn't have any current standing as being a publishing imprint for DC. But I found it an interesting point that we did this with Vertigo, with the imprint that was started based upon the sort of British invasion of comics in the 1980s, the legacy of Alan Moore and others who created a whole way of viewing mainstream comics in a new way and bringing in a wider audience that wasn't reading comics. And we wanted access to that audience. Mm-hmm. So in our minds, there was no other place to do this that would get the right draw, because technically you could have made the case, as Steve and I probably had this conversation at some point, of like, you could do this elsewhere. But we loved the fact that DC had inherited or purchased the superhero Uncle Sam from the Quality Comics group from the 40s. And there was some history of publishing him in a few adventures that occurred since the character was acquired in the 70s. But technically anybody could have done an Uncle Sam book the way we did it anywhere. But we wanted the platform. We wanted that place that we knew that there was other eyes looking at it with a sense of there's unique works coming out of Vertigo. And maybe if we were smarter, we would have figured out a way to somehow do this for whatever they could afford to pay at Fantagraphics, so that their critical magazine, the magazine of record back then at that time, was the Comics Journal, and they would give us a more favorable review because they always did with their own product.
Ooh, I've heard that.
I know. And
wait, did the Comics Journal not like Uncle Sam?
Actually, they did. They gave it a nice review.
Oh, okay. Okay. Because I was like, what? But I wasn't.
I think they kind of dissed other works of mine that I mean.
That's so them though. Oh God,
they gave me fair enough treatment. I can't really discredit them too much. I found it exhausting, the things that they would drill into in various critiques of contemporary work that was trying to push the medium, but often they were always handicapping them from the get-go, saying, well, this was published by Marvel or DC. And that seems a ridiculous thing with which to dismiss work, because there is a lot of creative statements made that are incredibly personal from the people making this material, whether it is a team of artists or a singular person. It can be incredibly intimate what's conveyed. And in a way, it is the final messaging of what comes out. And it doesn't have to necessarily mean, oh, but a corporation owns this thing now, so therefore it has less value. And if that guides your view and your evaluation of stuff, I think it's wrongheaded.
I will also say, too, Vertigo at the time was doing a lot of the bring back old characters and muck them up. So, I mean, in that respect, it like they were doing Kid Eternity and Shade the Changing Man, and, of course, Grant's run on the Doom Patrol with Richard Case, which was great.
Love it.
So, yeah, it felt like, at the time, all right, this is actually kind of an organic fit, because here we are with a character, purportedly with a character from the 1940s, and we're dirtying him up a little bit, or a lot. I don't think it occurred to us until later that there wasn't a lot of common ground between our book and the other revivals that they were doing at that time. But it was a good place to be, and my God, we got to work with some sympathetic editors and a terrific letterer, and I got to work with Alex Ross,
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so excited that everybody was going to be able to pick up this book at their local comic shop or online very soon, after it was, out of print for so long, which is like really a shame. And this is a really lovely printed edition. The art looks gorgeous. You know, you've got like Griel Marcus, like, you know, writing the opening, and is definitely a book that should be on every shelf for people who are interested in comics and politics. And I think this is also going to be a good one for me to unload on some of my friends who don't normally read comics as well. I think this could be something that they would get into because it's such an exciting, you know, concept. And just, I mean, there are moments where the ramblings of Uncle Sam, I just was like, that sounds like Trump, except I feel compassionate for him rather than disgust, because this man is clearly like in distress and indigent rather than like the most evil person alive, you know. But I was like, the disjointedness is just uncanny. But anyway, I want to thank you both again for your amazing time and for sharing your talents with us. And I know, Alex, you have a very active like YouTube channel. What are the main places people should go to keep an eye out on your work?
Oh man, I understand that I have social media. I've never seen it or been on it
Fair
myself.
enough.
So I have an agent who has set all those things up. So I've heard I have a Facebook page.
Yes.
I've never actually seen Facebook. So I don't know what it looks like.
I'll throw some links. I mean, you're not super hard to, there's only, you know, you're not super hard to track down on the internet. But Steve, if there are places that our listeners should be checking out your work.
I'm on the radio Saturdays and Sunday nights, and I publish a magazine about old show business. You know, I've done social media, but it's losing its appeal.
I hear you. The radio, can folks listen to it who are not in the Chicago area? Does it have an online?
Oh yeah, absolutely. All this stuff, you can learn about it all at nostalgiadigest.com.
Fabulous. Great. I'll have that link in the show notes. Thank you both again for your time. And I'm just I'm so excited to have you guys on the show. And it was so good to meet you both. And, you know, as someone who has gotten back into like doing figurative painting in recent years, it does sort of feel like uncanny that I get to talk to you at this point in my life rather than when I wasn't sitting there with like gouache myself struggling with trying to not have lines occur where I don't want them to be. And, you know, all that, all the sort of stuff that you worked out decades ago. But
still working on it. It's never solved.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. I am on Blue Sky predominantly for social media, which is for now, my handle is LEVIN. I am still on the other place sometimes for work, ELANA_Brooklyn. Also, remember that whatever volunteering or contributions you want to make towards the upcoming election, it's better to do it now than later. Any phone banking you do now, any deep personal conversations you may have with loved ones in swing states that you might want to do now, do it now. Don't do it at the last minute, because it makes so much more of a difference if you do it sooner than later. And with that, keep it geeky.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.